Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's NetSuite 2015 Year-End Training webinar. My name is Whitney Mahon, and I'm an account executive here at FMT Consultants, and I'm joined by Joe Lippert, one of FMT's senior NetSuite consultants. Now I'm going to hand it over to Joe, but before I do, if at any time during the presentation you have any questions, feel free to type them into the comment box. We will be monitoring it during the entire presentation.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for the FMT year-end close training. My name is Joe Lippert and I'm a senior consultant with FMT's NetSuite division. This training session will consist of 3 sections, the first being a PowerPoint presentation, secondly a demonstration performed in NetSuite, and third, as Whitney just mentioned, a question and answer session. Following the NetSuite year-end close training, FMT will provide all attendees with the FMT NetSuite Training Guide, NetSuite Year-End Training Guide. That contains the best practices from both the accounting perspective and a NetSuite systems perspective. And as you can see from our slide on the screen, here's a sample page. Let's begin with the topic overview. Today we'll be discussing permissions required for period management, accounts receivable closing, accounts payable closing, fixed asset closing, resolving date period mismatches, reviewing negative inventory, reviewing inventory costing, revaluing open foreign currency balances, accounting period closure, and accounting period management. Please note some users may have additional close tasks depending on the modules enabled in their NetSuite environments. FMT will be discussing the standard close task and will be available to assist with any additional close task training upon request. Our first slide here let's first go into permissions required. To perform the period close task listed in the NetSuite period close checklist, the user role will be required to have the following permissions: manage accounting periods and allow non-GL changes. Each of these permissions is located within the user role, specifically in the permissions subtab in the setup sublist. I'll demonstrate this to you in our demonstration to follow. I would also like to note a best practice would be limiting application of these permissions to specific user roles, such as accounting managers or controllers. Okay, for our first topic is accounts receivable closing task. The first step for performing the accounts receivable close task in NetSuite requires posting of all the transactions for the closing period into that month. When entering these transactions in NetSuite, it is important to consider the concept of cutoff and the transaction date versus posting period. Cutoff relates to the posting of transactions in the correct accounting period. For the transaction date and posting period, both of these fields are available on the AR transaction record. You'll typically want to ensure that the transaction date aligns with the posting period. For example, you may have a transaction with the date of January 13th, 2016, and a posting period of January 2016. An example of a mismatch would be the transaction would be dated January 13th, 2016, but the posting period may still be December 2015. So after the transactions have been posted for the period, we're able to perform the reporting for that period. To access these reports, the user will navigate to Reports, Customers/Receivables, and then select the desired reports, such as accounts receivable aging and the AR register. Additionally, the users can access the sales tax reports at period end and throughout the period by navigating to Reports, scrolling down to the bottom of Reports to Sales Tax US, and then selecting the desired reports. A third step for closing the accounts receivable task would be customer record management. This involves reviewing the activity of the customer and determining if they should remain active or should be marked inactive in NetSuite. It also involves updating the customer records as necessary. For example, removing a contact from a customer record that is no longer with that customer. The final step of the accounts receivable close is locking the accounts receivable close task in the period close checklist. We'll be reviewing this in our demonstration to follow. Our second topic is the accounts payable close task. Again, the first step of performing the accounts payable close task in NetSuite requires posting of all the transactions for the closing period into that month. When entering these transactions in NetSuite, it is important to consider the concept of cutoff and the transaction date versus posting period. Again, cutoff relates to the posting of transactions in the correct accounting period, whereas transaction date versus posting period, both of these fields are available on the AP transaction record, and you'll typically want to ensure that the transaction date aligns with the posting period as discussed previously. After the transactions have been posted for the period, we are able to perform the reporting for the period. To access these reports, navigate to Reports, Vendors and Payables, and select the desired reports. The third step is to perform vendor record management. This involves reviewing the activity of the vendors and determining if they should remain active or be marked inactive in NetSuite. It also, again, involves updating the vendor records as necessary, such as removing a contact that is no longer with that vendor. Next, we can review the 1099 reporting that occurs after all transactions have been posted for the period. In order for a vendor to appear on the 1099 reports, they must be configured as follows. The vendor record must be marked as 1099 eligible, and you must provide an EIN or a tax ID number in the EIN/tax ID field. Secondly, the chart of accounts must be configured for 1099s, specifically the 1099 box related to that chart of accounts. To access 1099 reports, navigate to Reports, Sales Tax US, and then Form 1099 MISP and Form 1096. The final step for the Accounts Payable Close task is locking the Accounts Payable task in the Period Close checklist. We'll be reviewing this performance in our demonstration to follow. Our third topic relates to the fixed asset closing process. There is not a close task for fixed assets in the period close checklist, but FMT did want to speak to the accounting best practices related to fixed assets as a period end. Performance of the fixed asset task can either occur directly in NetSuite using the fixed assets module, or it can be performed externally in either Excel or a separate fixed asset management software and then brought over into NetSuite. These tasks include such tasks as acquisitions, removals and disposals, depreciation, and so on. As mentioned, the fixed assets task can either be performed in NetSuite or external to NetSuite. If you have the fixed assets module, the user will navigate to the fixed assets header ribbon, select transactions, and then perform the various transactions in that list. If you do not have the fixed asset module, you'll have to be certain to enter the fixed asset activity into NetSuite, such as depreciation via a journal entry. After the fixed asset activity for the period has been recorded in NetSuite, we are now able to run our reporting for the period. If you have the fixed asset module, you can access the fixed asset reports under Fixed Assets, Reports, and then select the desired reports, such as depreciation schedule or asset value. If you do not have the fixed asset module, you'll be able to access the reports related to fixed assets using the balance sheets, which is under Reports, Financial, and Balance Sheet to view both your asset levels and your depreciation. Our fourth task relates to the Lock All task in the Period Close checklist. After AR, AP, and fixed asset activity has been performed, we are able to perform the Lock All task in the Period Close checklist. The Lock All task provides an additional layer of security for the accounts receivable, accounts payable, and payroll modules that have been individually locked previously. We will be reviewing the performance of this in the Period Close checklist in our demonstration to follow. The fifth task relates to resolving date period mismatches task in the NetSuite Period Close checklist. As discussed previously, for entering the accounts receivable and accounts payable task, the purpose of this task is to ensure that the transaction date and posting periods of the transactions are related to the month being closed and are in agreement with each other for reporting. An example of this would be one employee may be running reports by period and another may be running reports by date. If the transactions have a disagreement between the transaction date and the posting period, their reports could show different results. We will be reviewing the performance of this Period Close checklist task in our demonstration to follow. Our sixth and seventh topics are inventory-related close tasks. The first steps to performing the inventory close in NetSuite requires posting of all the transactions for the closing month and the period in that month. When entering these transactions into NetSuite, it is important to consider the concept of cutoff and transaction date versus posting period. Cutoff relates to posting transactions in the correct accounting period, whereas for the transaction date versus posting period, both of these fields are available on the inventory-related transaction records. You'll typically want to ensure that the transaction date aligns with the posting period. Again, for example, a transaction may have a date of January 13th, 2016, and the posting period would be January 2016. After all the transactions have been entered into NetSuite for the period being closed, we will want to begin our reconciliation of inventory. This process involves performing an inventory count to determine the physical inventory's quantities at all locations, and then performing any adjustments in NetSuite to ensure the physical count matches the quantities in NetSuite. During the reconciliation process, we will want to review for any negative inventory values and correct those as soon as possible. The reason behind this is that you will be required to review and correct any negative inventory quantities as part of the period close checklist task. As you can imagine, it will be helpful to address these inventory quantity issues during the performance of the reconciliation rather than revisiting the issue during performance of the period close checklist task. After the reconciliation has been performed, we are able to process the reports for inventory for the related period. To access these reports, navigate to Reports, Inventory, and select the desired report, such as the Inventory Valuation Report, or alternatively, we can view the balance sheet by going to Reports, Financial, and Balance Sheet. The next step is to perform the inventory record management. This involves reviewing the activity of the inventory and determining if they should remain active or should be marked inactive in NetSuite. An important consideration here is whether or not the inventory item is a component of a group, kit, or assembly that will continue to be sold. If the item is a member of any of those item types previously listed, you will want to make sure the item is not marked inactive. We will be reviewing the performance of this period close checklist task in our demonstration to follow. Our eighth topic is the revaluation of open foreign currency balances as of period end. The purpose of this task in the period close checklist is to ensure that the open transactions as of period end are accurately revalued for payment and reporting purposes. The key for this task is that this is only for open transactions to be revalued. An example of this, a US dollar base currency company enters a vendor bill in euros on the first of the month. The exchange rate at that point in time is 0.8554, for example. During the accounting period close on the 31st, the open vendor bill will need to be revalued for the exchange rate on the 31st. For example, on the 31st, the euro to US dollar exchange rate might have changed to 0.9554. Upon booking the foreign currency revaluation, the transaction will have an unrealized loss upon revaluation. Please note that the revaluation of open foreign currency balances can be performed at any time throughout the period and is required to be performed at period end as part of the period close checklist task. We will be reviewing the performance of this period close checklist task in our demonstration to follow. Our ninth task relates to closing of all the previously locked tasks in the period close checklist. Again, the purpose of this task is to close the previous locked task on the checklist to prohibit the posting of transactions in that closed period. We will be reviewing the performance of this period close checklist task in our demonstration to follow. As mentioned earlier in our presentation, an accounting best practice involves providing only a specific set of user roles access to the managed accounting period's permissions and area of NetSuite. After the period is closed, we can see the status of the accounting period is now marked closed, and we can view that in a summary view. In addition to our discussion for closing accounting periods, we also wanted to discuss creating new accounting periods and reopening closed accounting periods. For new period setup, we can set up all the accounting periods for our next year, and we will review this during our demonstration to follow. Regarding reopening closed periods, in NetSuite we are able to reopen closed accounting periods. It is important to consider the type of change required to that accounting period. In NetSuite there are two types of changes that can be performed, the first being a GL change, and the second being a non-GL change. If you need to perform a GL change, we will need to reopen the accounting period. If you need to make only a non-GL change, we can set the permissions for the user role and configure the accounting period to allow non-GL changes, both of which we'll show you in the demonstration to follow. So with that, that concludes our PowerPoint presentation portion of this discussion. I'll now go to NetSuite to begin our demonstration. Okay, so we have here our test environment, not any customers or FMT's environment, just a test. And let's start off with looking at our permissions required for accounting period management. If we go to Setup, Users and Roles, Manage Roles, I'm going to open this in a new tab. And this new tab being open, as discussed, we'll want to grant this permission to our controller or our accounting manager. So here we see the controller, and I can click Edit. Within this user role, I'm in the Permissions subtab and the Setup sublist. After clicking Setup, I can see the permissions Manage Accounting Period has already been granted, and the access level is full, as opposed to View. Additionally, we have a Allow Non-GL Changes permission, which again, this by default for the controller role is set to full. Please be certain to review your employees' records and user roles to ensure that permissions are set correctly. After permissions have been set, we can go and start our period close. After the transactions have been posted for the period, we're able to perform the reporting for the period. To access the reports for customers, we'll go to Reports, Customers and Receivables, and you can see here we're able to access a variety of reports such as AR aging and our AR register. Additionally, the user is able to access the sales tax reports by going to Reports, scrolling to the bottom for Sales Tax US, and then clicking on the desired sales tax reports, such as sales tax liability by tax agency or sales tax liability by tax item, which is essentially by tax code or tax rate. We can see those loaded here. Next, we'll perform our customer record management. To perform customer record management, we'll go to List, Relationships, and pull up a listing of our customers. And for our example, let's look at 3M. I'm going to go into edit mode on 3M. If we are no longer going to be receiving business from 3M, we may want to consider making their customer record inactive. With this, we'll scroll down to the bottom of the page, again in edit mode, click on System Information, and look for a field labeled Inactive. It's important to note that this field placement might not be the same in your system as it is in ours, as NetSuite can be configured to move fields throughout the form, or it could even be hidden. So that would be customer record management. Our final task for the accounts receivable close task would be performing the period close checklist task. For this, we'll go to Setup, Accounting, Manage Accounting Periods, and then we're directed to the Manage Accounting Periods page. From here, we can see a number of accounting periods. Some have been closed, as you can see, for 2013, and we can see here for 2014, which we're going to be working on closing 2014 of February together. But we can see here for January 2014, we have the period is closed, the AP transactions have been locked, the AR transactions have been locked, all GL transactions have been locked, and we're allowing non-GL changes. Comparing that to February 2014, we can see that February is not closed, AP is not locked, AR is not locked, all GL transactions are not locked, and we're not allowing non-GL changes. It's important to note that allow non-GL changes can only be enabled after that particular period has been closed. So let's go into February 2014 period close checklist. To access that, we'll look for the checklist column and click our magnifying glass and paper icon. This brings us to our period close checklist task for February 14. We can see the period name, the status, the start date, and the end date. So let's see here. Looking at our first task is locking AR. We can see the status of this task is open and it has not been modified. To enter this task, we can click the green arrow under Go to Task, and we're brought to the Lock Accounting Period AR. Here we can look at system information, and we can see that as of just a moment ago, I entered this and started a create value and gone to not started. We also have user notes if you want to add a note related to this accounting period closure. So I'm going to go ahead and lock accounting period AR. And this will bring us back to our period close checklist. We can now see that this has a status of closed, as previously it had a status of open. And we can see that it was modified by myself. Another important concept that I want to discuss before we dive too deep here is you can see that a number of these tasks have green arrows, which means we can address them right away. While a few of them, it may appear that they're actually locked. That's not the case. What's happening here is we have prerequisites that need to be performed in order to access each of these tasks. So for instance, you see here, looking at resolve date period mismatches, prerequisite, I hope you can see that, is lock all. So essentially we'll have to lock all, perform the lock all task in order for this task to be able to perform next. So with that being said, our accounts receivable is now locked and we're ready to move on to accounts payable. After the transactions have been entered into NetSuite for accounts payable, we're able to perform the reporting for the period. To access these reports, navigate to Reports, Vendors and Payables, and then select the various AP reports. And you can see here I've selected AP Aging and AP Register. These reports also can be customized with various options, aging increments, we can change the dates, and we can go into further customization as desired. Let's see, our next step here is performing vendor record management after we've processed our reports for the period. For that, we'll go to List, Relationships, and Vendors. And let's go into AL Systems Ltd in edit mode. And as mentioned earlier, we want to go ahead and inactivate this vendor. We haven't purchased from them in a number of periods and do not want to clutter our list of available vendors to enter bills. So with this, we'll look for the vendor is inactive, and in our environment this has actually been relabeled. It's still just the is inactive box. And this has been moved from our System Information subtab to the header of the field. Again, this may be the case in your environment if the form is customized. The next task for vendors and AP, we will review the 1099 management. There's an in-depth guide on 1099 configuration and reporting in the guide. For now, we'll just briefly go into the reports and I'll speak to the configuration required. On the vendor record, we'll need to make sure that the 1099 eligible field is marked and that a tax ID is added for that vendor. Additionally, we'll need the chart of accounts to be configured to align with the 1099 box setup. After both of these requirements have been completed and you've performed transactions for those vendors using both the correct account chart of accounts and the correct payment type, such as a check rather than a journal entry, you'll be able to see in our list of reports under Reports, Sales Tax US, Form 1099 Miss, and Form 1099 or 1096, which I'm opening in two tabs here. For this environment, we do not have any data prep for 1099 Miss. We can absolutely review this offline if following review of the packet you have additional questions. But as we can see here, we'll be able to have a vendor name, show their tax ID. We actually have a preview of the 1099 as it will appear printed. We'll be able to have edit notifications to see if it has been adjusted. We can see the 1099 applicable missed payments, the 1099 payments threshold, and payments that were excluded. Following review and completion of this 1099 missed task, we can review our 1096 and we can send to appropriate agency. The final step to our accounts payable close task would be performing the period close checklist task for AP. As you can see again, we have an open period or an open task here. To access this task, we'll click the green arrow under Go to Task, and we'll see System Notes here. We can see that we can add user notes, period applied, current status, the start date and end date. So for our purposes here, we're going to click Lock as everything has been performed previously, and our status now updates from open to close. The next topic of discussion is the fixed asset close task. As noted, there's not a close task in the period close checklist for fixed assets in this listing. But FMT did want to speak to the best accounting practices related to the fixed assets as of year end. If you do have the fixed assets module right here, you can see that we can perform our transactions by going to fixed assets, transactions, and performing our proposals, creations, which go hand in hand, our asset depreciation, disposals, revaluation, and splits. As well as after those transactions are performed, we can review our reports here with our asset register, summary, and our depreciation schedules. As mentioned, not everybody will have the fixed asset module, but what you could do in that case is perform your fixed asset activity during your AP or your AR related transactions, such as purchasing goods from vendors, fixed assets from vendors, or selling fixed assets to a third party. And then performing your depreciation outside of the system and perhaps an Excel spreadsheet, and then entering depreciation and via journal entry into NetSuite. So after all those tasks have been completed, we'll go ahead and one last thing I did want to touch on. As we noted with fixed assets, your reports are available here for fixed assets. If you do not have the fixed assets module, you can actually go to Reports, Financial, and review the balance sheet for not only your fixed asset balances, but also your accumulated depreciation. And you can also look at your income statement to view your depreciation expense. So our next task here is the Lock All task. And as we can see, it has a status of open. And we're going to go ahead and go to the task. And as we can see, the same information, period, status is unlocked, applicable start date and end date, system notes, and user notes. We want to add a memo. For our demonstration, we'll lock all accounting periods. And we see now, with this being performed, the status is closed. And now we have the availability to resolve the date period mismatches. So as discussed previously, for entering the accounts receivable and accounts payable tasks, the purpose of this task is to ensure that the transaction date and posting periods of the transactions are related to the month being closed and that they are in agreement with each other for reporting. Again, an example of this would be if one employee is running a report by period and another employee is running reports by date. If there's a disagreement between the transaction date and the posting period of the reports of the transactions, reports could see different results. And speaking to that feature, just a tidbit here, going to the home icon and set preferences, we can actually determine how we want to run our reports. Looking at analytics under set preferences, we can see that NetSuite gives us the option to run report by period for all reports, or financial, or never. So essentially what this is saying is that we want to run our financial reports, income statement, balance sheet, trial balance, by the posting period. So that would be January 2016 through January 2016. Whereas if we said never, we'd be able to run those reports by a specific date range, say January 2nd through January 7th. see. So to perform the resolve date period mismatches, we'll go into that task by clicking the green arrow. And we see that we don't quite have the option to mark task as complete yet. We do, however, have a resolve date period mismatch button. So I'll go ahead and click that. And this will bring us to the transactions with date period mismatches. And as we can see from our demo transactions, there's quite a few. We have a period of, say, January 2014 and a transaction date of February 12th. And again, we have transaction date of February, period of March, disagreements, March transaction date, February posting period. So to go in, you don't have to adjust these, but it's highly recommended that you do review and adjust where necessary. This one here is a view access because it's in a closed period and we left it as was, whereas these are in the current period and can be adjusted. So I'll go in and edit these in a new tab. And we can see since we're in February, let's just adjust this posting period. And this is an important thing to note. Typically when you're filling in a transaction and when you enter the date of the transaction, the posting period typically will automatically align with the date entered. But if you go ahead and save that transaction and come back and edit it after the fact, posting period might not be dynamic and may not update to reflect the transaction date update. So that's an important consideration when editing transactions. So in here, we're going to go ahead and move this into March since it's a March transaction date. And determinations of how these posting periods and transaction dates should align is really going to be an individual use case scenario. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to us after the seminar. So now with that all being performed, I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page. And we can see those two edit transactions are in agreement with each other, so there's no longer a mismatch. Again, this one is still listed because it was in January, and January is closed. So I'll go back to the period close checklist, and now I have the ability to mark this task as complete. With this, I'll click the Mark Task Complete button. And we can see that resolve date period mismatches is now complete and closed, and we have the ability to review negative inventory. So with that being said, that speaks to our next point, which is the inventory related close task. After all the transactions have been entered into NetSuite for the period being closed, we'll want to begin our reconciliation of inventory. This process involves performing an inventory count to determine the physical inventory quantities at all the locations, and then performing any adjustments in NetSuite to ensure the physical count matches the quantities in NetSuite. To access this, we'll go to Transactions, Inventory, and we can see here we have Enter Inventory Count or Create Inventory Count. When performing the inventory count, you will actually be asked to perform any adjustments and any reconciliation within that. But if you do not catch something and need to do a subsequent adjustment but don't want to perform the recount, we can actually just go up to here to adjust inventory or adjust inventory worksheet. There is a slight difference between these two transaction types. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to FMT for a solution. After the reconciliation has been performed, we are able to process the reports for the inventory for that period. To access these reports, go to Reports, Inventory, /Items, and we can now see our inventory revaluation and other desired reports. The next step is our inventory record management. To access the inventory items, we'll go to List, Accounting, Items, and pull up our list of items by clicking that link. I'm opening it here in a new tab, and we can use our filters to locate various item types. For our demonstration purposes, I'm going to look at this matrix item set up here of apparel, large jacket, black small, or black large. I'm going to click Edit. And again, an important consideration, if this item was a component of a group, a kit, or assembly, we wouldn't want to make this item inactive, as that would cause complications for that assembly, group, or kit item. Let's see here. And a little trick, if you're trying to find something again, we don't have a system information tab here where I would typically mark an item as inactive. A trick on how to find a field in NetSuite is you can use the Control F key to bring up our find. And as you can see, I clicked this icon on the right-hand side of these tabs, which actually took it, instead of a sublist view, exploded all those lists to be in a stacked manner. And now with this, we can actually access all the subtabs, and we can see that inactive was actually moved from the System Information tab to the header here. Whereas if this were buried in a subtab and these weren't expanded, we wouldn't be able to find all of it with the Control F. We'd have to click on each subtab and then do the Control Find function. So if I wanted to make that inactive, I would click that and click Save. Okay. So with all those tasks, we're now ready to move on to our inventory-related period close checklist tasks, such as reviewing negative inventory and reviewing our inventory costing. As we can see here, review negative inventory. This is now open, and we have the ability to enter and perform this task with the green arrow here. And as previously discussed, it is helpful to perform the review of negative inventory during your physical inventory count and reconciliation process. Because you are going to be forced to review and correct those negative inventory issues during the period close checklist, so just easier to get it out of the way. Let's see. So we'll go into that task and click Review Negative Inventory. And we see here, looking at our date, we have no negative inventory, and we can filter by locations if we need to. For now, let's go back to period close and mark this task as complete. Okay, and with that being said, we now have our review negative inventory tasks closed, and we have review inventory costing, cost accounting available. It is currently in an open state, and we're able to access that with the green arrow. Again, our marked task complete is not available until we perform our review of inventory costing. And click Review Inventory Cost Accounting. And we can see here that there is nothing that needs to have our calculation performed. Essentially, this task would be, you'd be able to review the item listings and review the cost associated with those items to see if there's any outliers, if there's any issues with your cost layers. We'd be more than happy to review this with you offline following this session. We go back to period close, and I'll now be able to mark this task complete. Okay. With that being completed, our next task is revalue open foreign currency balances. We see it's an open status, and we can enter it with the green arrow. One thing I would like to know, if we're looking at this transaction here, 123 demo AP3, we see here, let me actually go to demo AP4. So with demo AP4, we can see that the transaction date is February 1st, 2014. It's an agreement with our posting period. And as of the date that this was entered, our exchange rate is 0.50. However, when we look at list, accounting, currency exchange rates, we can open this in another tab, navigate into this tab now. We can actually type in here, and we can refresh the page. We can see that our US dollar to euro currency is now 0.9688 rather than the 0.5, and missed this earlier, euro is listed as our currency here. So with that being said, obviously between the date of transaction entry and the date as of our period close, we have we're going to have an unrealized loss on current foreign currency revaluation, and NetSuite will actually perform those and book those unrealized losses or gains through the period close checklist task. So for that, with going into the Revalue Open Foreign Currency Balances, we can click on Currency Revaluations. As you can see, we can't mark this task complete until we do so. With this, we can select all the various account types that we want to revalue for foreign currency revaluations. It's helpful to know that our base currency is US dollars. That's why this is grayed out. We're able to add a memo for this currency revaluation transaction, and we're able to use these filters to pull up the specific transactions we want. It's currently on all. I'm going to go ahead and revalue that bill only for demonstration, so I'm going to filter to accounts payable. And then looking at the bill, we see our account is 2000, our standard accounts payable account, not the commissions or the accounts payable to. So I'll unclick those, and I'll click Save. You can see here, give me one moment, folks. We can see here after refreshing the page, NetSuite took a moment to take hold of that. It is in the process of performing a currency revaluation, and we can see looking at, we see the transaction here, and it addressed one transaction to be revalued by that amount. We can actually also go back to currency revaluation, and we can see here within accounts payable, we see our last run date as of today, and we can view our results for that accounts payable foreign currency revaluation. Here's that transaction right here, transaction number, and we can see it's going to be a debit to, let me pull up the GL impact here, we can see it's going to be a debit to the unrealized gain or loss, so that's going to be a loss there, and a credit to accounts payable. Essentially, since the foreign currency exchange rate increased, we now are going to have to pay that vendor more, and we're going to recognize that as an unrealized loss at this point. And further, we can review this transaction to see a listing of all our open payables that have a currency revaluation. So with that, we can go back and we can mark this task complete. And with that being said, we can now see that all of these tasks are closed with the closed task remaining. We'll go ahead and click this green arrow here and enter the closed task. Here, we're simply going to hit close period. And this will bring us back to the period close checklist. We're seeing now that the status is closed, and we still have the ability to go back into this green arrow. I'll touch on this in just a moment. So I'm going to go back to the Manage Accounting Periods window here. And let's discuss adding additional accounting periods and reopening closed accounting periods. So to reopen a closed accounting period, as noted, there's two types of changes that can occur in a closed period. A GL-based change, which would be changing an account type, such as an expense account from one expense account to another, or adjusting a dollar value. For that would require actually going into the period, using the period close checklist icon, coming to the period close checklist again, and we can see actually by clicking this green arrow, we're able to come back in, and it's as simple as clicking reopen period. This is why we highly advise making certain that only a specific subset of user roles have the manage accounting period changes, as we would not want anybody to have the ability to go back and change the past. When you reopen an accounting period, you can see clicking this, you'll have to enter a value for justification, which we can see is this field here, and it is mandatory. So we could put a memo here saying that something was missed that was substantial and required reopening. For our demonstration, I'm going to leave this closed, but I believe with that presentation, you're able to see how to perform that. And let's go into the second type of change, which is allowing a non-GL change. As we noted earlier, January of 14 has that ability, allow non-GL changes, whereas February does not. It's important to note, to access this, you'll actually click under period name, February 14, and we can see here, allow non-GL changes. So we'll go ahead and click that and click Save. And as noted, the users will be required to have permissions, even with that box checked, to perform the allow non-GL changes in the period. And with that being performed, we now have that box, or that field, filled in as desired. It's also important to note that these two periods are closed. That's why we have the ability to click that option for allow non-GL changes. With March 14, this period remains open. So you can see here, we don't have the ability to check this until it's closed, it's grayed out. So that's an important consideration. To set up a new accounting period, we'll stay on the Manage Accounting Periods page, and we'll set up, let's go with a setup full year. This is the easiest setup. And we can see here we're able to define our first fiscal month of the year. Let's stick with January. And we're going to follow a typical calendar year, so this will be ending in 2016. If your fiscal year ended in 17, if it was June, for instance, we could push that over to 17. We can choose our period formats. We can either go with calendar months, 4 weeks, 4-4-5 weeks. Let's stick with calendar months. We can affect how we want our periods to be named, either with the starting year to be in the period name or the ending year in the period name. This field here, 1 day year and adjustment period. Essentially, this is a separate period on the last day of the year in which the accounting department could perform all of their year-end adjustments. So for instance, if we chose calendar months, we would have 12 periods. And then if we check this, we would actually have a 13th period, which would fall on December 31st of the year based on the calendar. So again, if we check that, we'd have 13 periods. With that being said, we can go ahead and actually save this, and we can create our 2016 period. And we can see here that it was just added, and everything is unlocked. So with that being said, that concludes our demonstration part of our presentation, and we're ready to field question and answers. Give us one moment to aggregate all your questions and we'll begin to address them. If we don't have time to address everybody, we'll be sure to get back to you. We have all your contact information and we'll be following up with responses to those questions and also with our NetSuite year-end close guide.